Every morning, without fail, I start my day the same way. I step out onto my front porch with a cup of coffee, my Bible, and a few minutes of quiet prayer before the world wakes up. That simple routine had been part of my life for years, long before I moved into this neighborhood, but apparently, it was also the thing that triggered a full-scale HOA meltdown that landed me on their hit list. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was subtle. The HOA president, a stern-faced woman who always wore the same beige cardigan like it was part of a uniform, slowed down her morning walk to glare at me while I sat on my porch with my hands folded, eyes closed. "Welcome to Bodycam Findings, subscribe or HOA will come at you." I thought nothing of it, assuming she was just being nosy, until I found the envelope tucked into my door that afternoon, a formal notice of violation stamped across the front. Inside, the letter accused me of engaging in unauthorized public religious expression visible from the street, and demanded that I refrain from conducting personal religious activities in areas visible to neighbors. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank. There was no way a neighborhood HOA could legally regulate prayer on private property, especially something as harmless as silent morning prayers on my own porch. But as I read further, the letter cited a ridiculous interpretation of the HOA's community aesthetic and conduct guidelines, specifically a clause about maintaining secular visual harmony in all visible spaces to ensure an inclusive atmosphere for all residents. I had to read that part 3 times just to process the absurdity. According to the HOA, the sight of me sitting on my porch with my Bible and bowed head was somehow a disruption to the community's aesthetic. They weren't just attacking my faith, they were treating prayer itself like a landscaping violation. The letter gave me 48 hours to cease all visible religious activity in common view, warning that failure to comply would result in escalating fines, community sanctions, and potential legal action under the HOA's authority to enforce aesthetic conformity. I stood there, holding the letter, caught somewhere between confusion and fury, wondering how a group of suburban busybodies thought they had the power to dictate how I practiced my faith on my own porch. That evening, I called a few neighbors, curious if anyone else had ever received something similar, and that's when I learned I wasn't the only target. One family had been warned about a small wooden cross hanging on their front door. Another neighbor was fined for placing a decorative plaque in their garden that had a verse from Psalms carved into it. It wasn't about me, it was about control, and the HOA had apparently decided that religious expression of any kind, even the gentlest and most personal, had no place in their cookie-cutter vision of neighborhood perfection. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that my faith wasn't some casual hobby I could tuck away whenever it became inconvenient. My faith was my foundation, the thing that got me through losing my mother, through financial struggles, through every storm life had thrown my way. They weren't just telling me to stop praying, they were asking me to betray the very core of who I was. The next morning I stepped onto my porch as usual, but this time I brought something extra. A large wooden cross I had made years ago, weathered from age, which I placed right beside my rocking chair. I opened my Bible, bowed my head, and prayed out loud, not shouting, not making a spectacle, just loud enough for anyone passing by to hear words of thanks, hope, and peace filling the morning air. The HOA president stormed past my house not 15 minutes later, clutching her binder like a life raft, shaking her head in visible disgust. That afternoon, a second violation notice appeared on my door, this one thicker, packed with references to vague guidelines about public displays and unapproved personal conduct visible from community spaces. They even called out my cross, labeling it unauthorized religious decoration, and ordered its immediate removal under threat of fines. I knew right then that this wasn't just about me anymore, it was about whether anyone in this neighborhood had the right to live according to their beliefs, whether religious, cultural, or personal, without the HOA playing morality police. That night, I opened my Bible to Matthew 5 verse 14, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." The HOA wanted me to hide my faith behind closed doors, to make it invisible, irrelevant, powerless. But that's not how faith works. Faith belongs in the light, out where people can see it. Not because you force it on anyone but because you live it openly, unapologetically, a quiet example of what peace and conviction really look like. The next morning I prayed again, this time with my front door wide open, music playing softly from my phone, gospel songs filling the air. Neighbors walking their dogs stopped to listen. One waved and said, "Amen." The HOA wanted to make me feel isolated, but they accidentally gave me a platform. They wanted me to hide. Instead, they gave me a reason to stand taller, to pray louder, to make my porch a beacon instead of a hiding place. This was no longer just a personal routine. This was the opening shot in a battle for something much bigger than property values. The HOA said I couldn't pray on my porch. Now, the whole neighborhood was about to hear every single word. Less than 24 hours after my second morning prayer with the door wide open and my cross standing proudly beside my rocking chair, the HOA struck back with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. I woke up to find a certified letter taped to my door, not just a violation notice this time, but an official cease and desist order drafted by the HOA's legal committee, warning that my persistent public religious conduct constituted a violation of community standards, and if I didn't stop, they would begin formal proceedings to place a lien on my home. That's right. The HOA was threatening to financially attack my property over prayer on a porch. They claimed my visible faith practice was making the neighborhood uncomfortable for non-religious residents, that it was creating an environment of exclusion, and, most absurdly, that my morning prayers might legally classify my porch as a religious venue, which would violate zoning laws. It was so insane I had to sit down and reread it twice just to make sure it wasn't satire. I wasn't running a megachurch. I wasn't preaching with a microphone. I wasn't holding baptisms in the garden hose. I was praying, quietly, peacefully on my own property, the same way someone else might meditate or read the newspaper, and somehow, that had become the HOA's public enemy number one. What the HOA didn't realize, and what became crystal clear over the next few days, was that my neighbors had been watching the whole thing unfold, and they were not impressed. Some were Christians like me who saw my prayers as something comforting and familiar. Others weren't religious at all, but they understood exactly what was happening. If the HOA could attack me for praying, what would stop them from going after someone for meditating, flying a pride flag, or even something as harmless as displaying cultural decor during holidays? The HOA wasn't protecting inclusivity, they were enforcing conformity, and that made people uncomfortable in a way no prayer ever could. By the end of the week, a new group chat appeared in my phone. Porch Rights, created by my next-door neighbor who had been quietly documenting every interaction between me and the HOA since the first violation. People were furious, not just at the religious targeting, but at the sheer arrogance of the HOA thinking they had the power to dictate personal behavior on private property. The group chat exploded with offers to write letters, attend HOA meetings, and even pray with me on my porch in solidarity, turning what was once a personal routine into a full-blown neighborhood movement. That Saturday morning, I opened my door to find 5 of my neighbors already waiting, Bibles in hand, folding chairs under their arms, ready to pray beside me. The HOA president stormed down the street like she was marching into battle, demanding everyone disperse because this constituted an unauthorized religious gathering. One of my neighbors, a retired Marine who had zero patience for her nonsense, calmly informed her that this was private property, and there was no HOA rule that prohibited neighbors sitting together peacefully on a porch. She sputtered something about noise complaints, but it was 9 a.m. and all we were doing was praying, not blasting music, not throwing a party, just praying. The next day the HOA smear campaign began. A neighborhood-wide email went out, accusing me of turning personal religious expression into a divisive public spectacle, claiming my prayers were disrupting community cohesion, and creating a religious imbalance in public perception of the neighborhood's values. It was bureaucratic word salad trying to disguise one ugly truth. The HOA couldn't stand that someone dared to live differently. They attached blurry photos taken from across the street showing my cross, my Bible, and the small crowd of praying neighbors, but instead of making me look bad, the photos made the HOA look like creeps spying on peaceful people sitting on a porch. The smear campaign flopped spectacularly. That night, someone updated the group chat name from Porch Rights to the Porch Revival, and by the following weekend, my small prayer circle had doubled in size, with neighbors of all backgrounds, religious and not, bringing lawn chairs, snacks, and their own symbols of personal belief to display proudly beside my cross. There were prayer beads, meditation cushions, pride flags, and even a garden gnome wearing a yarmulke. Not because anyone was trying to start a religious war, but because the neighborhood was united in telling the HOA, "You don't get to decide what we believe, and you definitely don't get to dictate what we do on our own porches." The HOA president tried to send formal warnings to everyone who attended, but the neighborhood was now fully activated. People stopped answering her calls, refused to sign for her certified letters, and even started praying for her every time she walked past my house. It was the most polite rebellion imaginable, but it was still a rebellion. The HOA wanted my porch empty, silent, and controlled. Instead, they accidentally turned it into the most famous porch in the neighborhood, a place where people gathered not just to pray, but to reclaim their personal freedom. The HOA said I couldn't pray on my porch. Now, my porch had become a sanctuary, not just for me but for anyone who believed that community should celebrate differences, not crush them under pointless rules. And with every prayer, every porch gathering and every peaceful moment shared between neighbors, the HOA's grip on our street slipped further through their fingers. By the time the third weekend rolled around, the HOA had stopped pretending they were just concerned about aesthetic harmony or community cohesion. The new violation letter, hand-delivered by the HOA president herself, who was shaking with rage, accused me of knowingly orchestrating a public demonstration designed to undermine the authority of the HOA, a claim so ridiculous I actually laughed out loud while she stood there. I told her that if praying with my neighbors on my own porch counted as a demonstration, then so did every garage sale, lemonade stand and block party the street had ever held, and by her logic, half the neighborhood was guilty of hosting illegal gatherings. She didn't like that comparison. She didn't like that the porch revival was no longer just about me, it was a block-wide movement and she was rapidly losing control. What she definitely didn't like was the fact that several of my praying neighbors had started digging into the HOA's finances, rule enforcement records, and the president's own history as queen of the clipboard kingdom. The first cracks appeared when we realized that the HOA president had never actually paid her own violation fines issued for the very same petty offenses she loved to slap on other homeowners. Her fence was taller than regulation height. Her garden had unapproved decorative statues. Her husband's truck had been illegally parked overnight multiple times, but every violation mysteriously disappeared before it was officially recorded. She was the enforcer and the exception, a tyrant with immunity. Things only got worse when we dug into the HOA's budget and found thousands of dollars labeled administrative expenses, with no actual breakdown of what was purchased. The HOA had also spent community funds to hire a private compliance consultant, who turned out to be the president's own niece, paid $150 an hour to spy on homeowners and write up fake complaints. The deeper we looked, the more rotten it got. There were suspicious payouts to a landscaping company owned by the vice president's brother. There were invoices for legal consultations that never actually happened, and a line item labeled Community Cultural Enhancement that was nothing but a $3,000 dinner bill from a steakhouse where the board held their planning retreats. The hypocrisy was so blatant it practically oozed off the page. The same people who told me my prayers were disruptive were quietly looting the neighborhood treasury while hiding behind fine print and fake authority. So we did the only logical thing, we held a porch court hearing. We set up a projector on my porch, invited the entire neighborhood, and walked everyone through every shady transaction, every buried violation, and every crooked deal that had kept the HOA in power for so long. It wasn't just me standing there, it was a coalition of neighbors, each one holding a piece of evidence, a receipt, a letter, a screenshot, or a recording, each one proving that the HOA had never cared about property values or community harmony. They cared about power and profit, and the only threat they truly feared was a neighborhood that realized they didn't need an HOA at all. Pearl Necklace Woman, who had once proudly patrolled the block looking for unauthorized garden flags, shrank into her seat when we showed how she had expensed a spa weekend as a committee wellness retreat. The HOA president turned bright red when we projected her own unfiled violations onto the side of my house, complete with timestamps showing how every notice mysteriously disappeared before it could be enforced. By the end of the night, the neighborhood had seen enough. A spontaneous vote was held right there on the porch, and the result was unanimous. The entire board was formally recalled, effective immediately. Neighbors began chanting, "This porch is ours," and someone even rang my cross like a victory bell. The HOA had tried to make my porch a symbol of disobedience, but we turned it into a courtroom, a town hall, and a victory stage all in one. The next morning, the HOA president resigned in disgrace, and the remaining board members followed like rats fleeing a sinking ship. With no leadership left, the HOA collapsed under its own weight, and the neighborhood agreed to dissolve it permanently, replacing it with the Porch Council, an informal group of volunteers who would gather on my porch anytime the community needed to discuss anything. The same porch the HOA tried to silence became the center of power for the entire street, not controlled by rules, but by actual conversations between neighbors who trusted each other. The HOA wanted me off my porch. Instead, they handed me the keys to the neighborhood. The porch didn't just survive, it became a courthouse, a pulpit, a soapbox, and a stage all rolled into one. And as my neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder with me, holding hands and praying together, we knew one thing for certain. This porch would never belong to anyone but the people who gathered on it. The HOA said I couldn't pray on my porch. Now, my porch was where the neighborhood came to pray, to speak, to vote, and to remember that no rule is stronger than a street that stands together. With the HOA dissolved and the neighborhood fully embracing self-governance through the Porch Council, my front porch transformed into something much bigger than anyone expected. What had once been a quiet place for personal prayer had now become the heart and soul of our block, the meeting place for every decision, celebration, and spontaneous gathering the neighborhood ever needed. Whenever something came up, from planning a block party to figuring out who was going to clear snow off the sidewalks, the solution was simple: meet at the porch. Without the HOA's constant oversight, people felt free to actually express themselves. The block started changing almost overnight. Front yards that had once been sterile displays of beige conformity exploded with personality, painted fences, quirky lawn art, brightly colored flower beds, and seasonal decorations that stayed up as long as people wanted, with nobody handing out fines. One family painted their garage door with a mural of our infamous porch court, complete with a cartoon version of Pearl Necklace Woman holding her clipboard like a sword. Another neighbor turned their front lawn into a wildflower meadow, a direct response to the HOA's old rule requiring only grass cut to exactly 2.5 inches. The porch became the neighborhood bulletin board. People posted event flyers, yard sale notices, lost pet alerts, and even birthday party invitations, all pinned to a corkboard I hung up beside my front door. Instead of being ruled by anonymous complaints and surprise violation letters, we handled everything face-to-face with conversations and compromise, and it actually worked. If someone's music was too loud, they got a friendly knock on the door instead of a threat. If someone's dog got loose, the whole street helped corral it, instead of filing a formal complaint about pet containment violations. The porch became a living symbol of everything the HOA tried to suppress: community built on connection instead of control. But what none of us expected was how far the story would spread. It started small. A local reporter who had covered our HOA funeral came back to do a follow-up on the newly formed Porch Council, writing a piece called "The Porch That Took Back the Block." That article got picked up by a state newspaper, then a national one, until suddenly my porch was famous. Not because it was fancy, but because it represented something everyone secretly wanted: the right to live in peace without being micromanaged. Homeowners from all over the state started showing up just to see it. They wanted to stand on the porch, take a picture, and hear the story directly from the people who lived it. I even gave a few impromptu porch tours, walking visitors through the whole saga, from the first violation notice to the final vote that killed the HOA. Some visitors brought gifts: homemade porch signs, decorative crosses, and even a wooden plaque that read, "In this house, we pray, and no HOA can stop us." It was funny at first, until I realized how serious some of these visitors were. They were not just curious, they were desperate. They came from neighborhoods where HOAs had taken over every aspect of life, where people could not even plant flowers without filling out forms and waiting for approval from a board that barely knew their names. They were not just looking at my porch, they were looking for hope. That is when we decided to make the Porch Summit official. A yearly event where anyone from any neighborhood could come to our street, sit on the porch, and learn exactly how we overthrew our HOA. We shared copies of our bylaws, walked them through the process of filing financial transparency requests, and even gave them templates for recall petitions and community votes. The porch became more than a meeting place. It became a classroom for suburban revolution, a crash course in how to take back control from power-hungry boards who forgot what neighborhoods are supposed to be about. Each year, more people came, some bringing their own HOA horror stories: fines for having too many pumpkins on Halloween, violations for installing solar panels, threats over painting a front door anything other than pre-approved beige. Every story fueled the movement, proving our street was not alone. The fight for porch freedom was happening everywhere, and now my porch was the symbol they rallied around. Media outlets started calling it the porch that defeated the HOA, turning it into a kind of pilgrimage site for homeowners who dreamed of breaking free. Even local officials got involved. One council member proposed a resolution honoring our block for contributions to community self-governance, and while it sounded overly formal, we accepted it, and hung it proudly on the porch wall next to the cross that started it all. What the HOA meant to silence had become a voice for every neighborhood that ever felt trapped by unnecessary rules. And through it all, I still prayed every morning, right there on the same porch, the Bible on my lap, the cross beside me, the neighborhood around me. But now, my prayers were never alone. Neighbors often stopped by, coffee in hand, joining me for a quiet moment before the day began. Not because they shared my exact beliefs, but because they shared the belief that everyone has a right to live their truth in the open without fear of fines or judgment. The HOA said I could not pray on my porch. Now, my porch was famous because I did. And every morning, as the sun came up over a block filled with color, creativity, and conversations instead of complaint letters, I thanked God, not just for the victory but for the community that rose up beside me to claim it. The porch was no longer just a piece of my house. It was a symbol, a story, and an invitation to every neighborhood everywhere. Take back your porches, take back your homes, and never let anyone tell you that faith, creativity, or individuality need permission to exist. Long after the HOA dissolved, long after the last violation letter was shredded, and long after the old guard slinked away into irrelevance, my front porch stood strong, not just as a piece of my home, but as a permanent monument to freedom, faith, and community. The neighborhood never forgot what the porch meant. Every year, on the anniversary of the HOA's downfall, the entire block gathered on my lawn for what we called Porch Day, part celebration, part community meeting, and part living history lesson for new families who moved in after the war was won. We retold the story from the very beginning. The first violation, the first prayer, the first time neighbors showed up with their folding chairs and their faith in each other. Kids who were toddlers when the battle started now stood up and proudly told the next generation how the porch became the heart of the block. At some point, the tradition evolved. Now, every new family that moves onto the street is officially welcomed on the porch, where they ring the cross like a bell to announce they are part of the community. Every family gets a welcome basket that includes a hand-carved wooden ornament shaped like my rocking chair, a small notebook with the full written history of the porch revival, and a laminated copy of the very first violation notice that started it all, framed like a relic from a bygone war. The neighborhood changed, but not because of rules, because people felt free to make their homes reflect who they really were. One house painted their shutters bright teal just because they could. Another neighbor built an elaborate koi pond with a tiny arched bridge in their front yard. No permits, no permission slips, just creativity flowing freely. Holiday decorations became legendary. People went over the top on purpose, not out of competition, but as a tribute to the years they spent fearing fines for putting up one extra strand of lights. The porch became the centerpiece of every major neighborhood event. Weddings were held there, anniversary parties spilled out onto the lawn, and even birthday parties for the neighborhood kids often started with a game called Find the Violation, where they ran around looking for funny fake violation notices neighbors hid for them to discover. The porch also became a symbol far beyond our block. Porch Summit grew bigger each year, turning into a statewide gathering of homeowners looking to overthrow their own oppressive HOAs. People traveled hundreds of miles to sit on the porch, touch the cross, and hear the story firsthand. They called it visiting the birthplace of suburban freedom. Some even sent letters to my house, handwritten notes thanking the neighborhood for proving that ordinary homeowners could stand up to power and win. A group of law students from a nearby university used our story as the focus of a research paper on the abuse of HOA authority, and they titled it The Porch That Prevailed. At one point, a documentary crew showed up to film the whole saga, blending old video clips, news coverage, and interviews with my neighbors into a full-length film that premiered, where else? On my porch, projected onto my garage door while the entire block sat in lawn chairs eating popcorn. The legacy even reached the legal system. After hearing about our story, a state representative proposed a new law requiring all HOAs to undergo mandatory financial audits every year and to provide homeowners with direct veto power over new rules through open voting. They called it the Porch Protection Act in honor of our street. Pearl Necklace Woman's old house eventually sold, and the new family who moved in built a second porch, a direct tribute to what happened. They hung a sign that read "Freedom Lives Here" and set out a rocking chair identical to mine. It became a game for visitors. Sit in both chairs, take a picture, and post it online with the hashtag #PorchRights. Every morning, I still sit in my original chair, Bible in hand, coffee steaming beside me, and the cross still standing tall by my side. But now the prayers are not just for me. They are for my neighbors, for new families moving in, for anyone still trapped under the thumb of a tyrannical HOA somewhere who dreams of finding their own porch freedom. What started as one person quietly praying in defiance became a movement. Proof that faith, whether in God, community, or the simple belief that your home should actually feel like your home, is a force no HOA can defeat. The HOA said I could not pray on my porch. Now, my porch was a landmark, a piece of living history, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary revolutions can begin. And every morning as the sun rises, the cross casts a shadow across the porch floor, and I smile, knowing that no matter how much time passes, no matter who comes and goes, this porch will always stand for freedom, faith, and neighbors who chose each other over fear. My porch started as mine alone. Now, it belongs to everyone who ever believed that home is not just a place. It is a promise, that here you can be yourself. No permission required.